Today on Page and Screen, it's all about the television phenomenon that is Ted Lasso. Jeremy Egner is a television editor for the New York Times, overseeing coverage of the medium and the people who make it. His book, Believe, the untold story behind Ted Lasso, the show that kicked its way into our hearts, is out in bookshops today from Dutton. Jeremy, welcome to the program.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, absolutely. So first, tell me, from your perch at the New York Times, you really must see the breadth of the American television landscape. So, was there a personal connection to Ted Lasso, or was it, obviously this is an early show for one of the first shows for Apple. I mean,
Mhm.
was it just an interesting time? What made you want to dig in and do a full book on the world of Ted Lasso?
Well, I had written about it quite a lot while it was on, right? And that was just kind of an interesting time all around. And that's part of the story, right? The fact that it landed in the middle of this pandemic and became such an inspiration for people. But one of the last things I did during its run was a profile of Brett Goldstein, who played, everybody's favorite Grouch, Roy Kent in the show. And went over to London, hung out with him for a little bit, and did that last year. And then that did really well. It was really popular. People enjoyed it. And out of that came an opportunity to write sort of something bigger about the show as a whole. And, the more I thought about it, the more I concluded that, the story of the show itself, is as fascinating and heartwarming and unlikely as the show, right? Just from its origins as this soccer ad on NBC like over a decade ago now, to the fact that it did land in the middle of the pandemic. It became this, kind of beacon for folks, far and beyond the usual reaction to a television show, just in terms of like how emotionally people got attached to it. And then it just kind of went away, right? And so, and within that, for now, anyways, I guess I should give that caveat. But within that, there's all these interesting stories about how people came to be involved with it. How you know these crazy turns of fate that landed people into these roles that they became instantly famous for, and there's a lot to dig into.
Yeah, and really just at the very beginning, because if for people that have watched the show at the front, you see based on characters created by, which is a bit of a strange thing because in the world
Sure.
of film and television, I mean, I'm always doing things that are usually optioned from like a book or a play or someone's life rights, but this was, as you say, it was an ad campaign.
Hmm.
And so how did that sort of come to be? Because first of all, that was an ad campaign for NBC, and then now we have the show that ultimately is a from Warner Brothers Television is on Apple. So
Hmm.
it's very much like outside the ecosystem. A lot of, media companies will try to, pull from whatever they have in house in their library. But this took, as you said, it was close to a decade, and
Hmm.
Jason Sudeikis was integral to all of it, pulling it together.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, Hollywood, loves IP, right? As we know, but this was not the usual variety. And the only other sort of example that I could think of was like that Geico ad show, or the caveman ad from a few years ago, which is nobody's idea of like uh,
Success.
exactly. Good. Yeah. Well, but um, so yeah, it started off as a soccer ad for NBC, and it became kind of a viral hit. Jason went over and invented this coach character, and it was, the whole concept of the ad was that he was an American football coach being asked to go over and coach, European soccer, British soccer, and it was an ad for NBC Sports coverage of the Premier League. They just got the rights to it, and they were trying to make a big splash when it was coming out. And, that went really well. It was very funny. I mean, it was a lot goofier than the show, a lot more slapsticky. And, the coach was kind of like a more, somewhat more cliche, kind of shouty coach. Um, but it did well enough that, again, another thing Hollywood loves is sequels. And they did another ad, the next year. And at that time, something about the fact that there's more depth to the character in a weird way. It was still an ad, obviously, but what had come out is he'd sort of like fallen in love with England, and English culture was kind of the concept of it. And so it seemed to have more layers, or at least hints of more possible layers. And at the time you mentioned, NBC, I mean, they wanted to turn it into a show, and they did go down the road of trying to figure out, what should it be? Where should it run? Can it run as like part of NBC Sports? I mean, is it its own thing? And they had some deals with BBC, I think, to co-produce, and then ultimately it kind of fell apart. The various principals decided they didn't want to be a part of it, and so then it just kind of sat for a while, right? And then Sudeikis he never forgot about it, He always liked it. He loved the experience of putting it together with his friends, Joe Kelly and Brendan Hunt, who we all know now as Coach Beard, and kind of always want to revisit it. And they even threw up, the three of them put together a concept for a show. They ended up being much of what we saw in that first season, but again, they didn't really have a deal in place, and so that kind of sat for a while. And what it really took was Bill Lawrence, who is probably best known for Scrubs and Spin City, and he just had a show called Bad Monkey that was also quite funny. But he and Sudeikis were talking about some other deal, some other show they wanted to work on together that didn't quite work out. And Lawrence was kind of like, "Well, do you have anything else?" He's like, "Well, I got the soccer thing. Me and my friends were kind of kicking around, no pun intended, sorry, for a little bit. I don't know if it's anything." And then they sent what they had to Lawrence, and he's like, "Oh, this is definitely a show. We should develop this." And that's kind of how it got the ball rolling. And Lawrence already had a deal with Warner Brothers, and so that became the producing studio. And then they took it around town, and they received plenty of rejections from what I hear. And Apple, which wasn't even on the air yet, was like, "Yeah, sure, we'll take it."
Right. And when it did finally come onto the air, with Apple, I mean, it was a very, dark time in the US and around the world, really, because we were, I think it was in August, right? So we were a
Mhm.
few months into COVID. The politics in America were at a really at a boiling point, I think,
Mhm.
too. So is some of this attributed to, it was just that moment and when we needed this bit of hope and shimmer in our lives?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a real big part of it. An interesting thing is it you like you say, it debuted in August 2020, but it was a real slow build. You know what I mean? It wasn't like immediately in September everybody's watching it. It took, quite a few months really to kind of catch on, and it was a lot of word of mouth. I mean, I was even as perhaps particularly as a television professional, I was very skeptical. I'm like, it's based on that goofy ad. How could that possibly be a 10 episode whatever? Um, so I didn't even really pay attention to it at first either. But the more I heard people talking about, like, this is actually a pretty good show, the more interested I got, and that was sort of the trajectory of the show itself. Sudeikis said that I think it was like the holidays of 2020 into 2021 is when it seemed like a lot of people either caught on or rewatched it or whatever, because he started hearing from people like in early 2021, and that's kind of when it started to build. And pretty soon, it's winning Peabody's, it's getting all of this acclaim, and then it got a ton of Emmy nominations for its first season.
And I mean, the amazing thing also about the show is that over the course of the series, as we watched it, it comes across a pretty simple and straightforward show at the beginning, but then you
Mhm.
realize there really are all these layers to it, and but it was very much, it sounds like it was very much fully baked from the start. And I think that, you talk a lot about, some of the influences that Jason and other people had with putting the show together and paying homage to certain shows and some of the sports movies people,
Mhm.
experienced growing up. And that, I guess, an early way of pitching it was talking about is this kind of, sort of a love child between like the British Office and Friday Night Lights,
Right,
which,
right.
when you think about that, it's like, oh, that's kind of exactly what it is. But
Mhm.
there's a lot of, and especially for audiences who don't love sports, there's
Mhm.
really a lot of heart in that. But it sounds like these guys really took a lot of, all the writing staff took a lot of the shows that they loved growing up and put little nuggets in there of them.
Mhm. Yeah, part of it was, what they wanted to do was to set up a whole lot of stereotypes, right? To that people think that they know. So they actually based it on that 1989 movie Major League, right, which was about this woman was the owner of the team, and she was trying to scuttle it, and so she, brought on all these scrubs to make the team go, turn into a cellar dweller, and of course they turned it around and became a big victorious run for them. So they kind of base a lot of the initial kind of concept on that, with the idea that they would then subvert it, right? And so it's like you have kind of the ball buster character in Rebecca Weldon, who's sort of based roughly on that Major League character, who seems very domineering and like, the kind of bitch and heels, forgive the expression, but um, you know, and then you peel back all these layers to her, right? And then you realize that the reason she's doing this is because she's been emotionally devastated by the collapse of her marriage and the way she's been treated. Roy Kent is like, the gruff veteran, and but you realize what he's sort of angry about is just his own mortality and the end of his career and all this kind of stuff. The prima donna is revealed to have a rough relationship with his father. So it's like basically what the show's encouraging you to do is to make assumptions and then realize that your assumptions were wrong. And with the idea that that kind of parallels the way we interact with one another in the world, right? We always meet people and most of us go, oh, it's one of those types of people. It's oh, that's a Republican, or that's, a blue collar worker or whatever. And then, we indulge our biases at times. And then you realize, oh no, they're actually people and they have layers just like the rest of us. And that's kind of what the show is trying to do. In a sort of big way, was kind of create this tapestry of all these people kind of discovering new things about one another and helping each other grow in the process.
Well, it does, and I think that the tricky thing about that is always going to come down to the casting, which I wanted to ask you about because
Mhm.
especially when it comes to the chemistry between all these players, and as the expression goes, dying is easy, comedy is hard. So,
Right, sure.
from the start, two of the creators were set to star in it, but then as other actors were picked up, a lot of these talents that we now know, they were really prolific theater actors and actors who
Mhm,
were even writing their own shows in the UK.
mhm.
But really, to begin with, Rebecca was pivotal to all of that, right?
Sure. Yeah, and they knew that she was gonna be the most important character to get right, certainly in that first season, because she was essentially the co-lead, the female lead of the show. And she's the one who makes the whole story go, right? And she has to pull off that pivot from being very domineering and icy in the beginning and kind of believably turn into somebody who is, hurting and sort of acting out of pain and lashing out. And then all the way back around again towards a sort of redemption. And so, yeah, I mean, Hannah Waddingham, as people have talked about a lot, was best known probably at that point for saying shame, shame, shame on Game of Thrones, as the kind of evil nun during Cersei's Walk of Shame on that show. Uh, but she'd had this long, long career in British theater. She's an incredible singer. She was, worked for decades in the West End of musical theater. She had, stateside, she had worked in shows like, the first run, the original cast of Spamalot. And so, that was kind of her background. And obviously the show gave her lots of ways to, use her various talents. I mean, one story that she told was that, when she was walking out of the initial um, audition or chemistry read with Jason, somebody's like, does this character sing after having her had her audition and the vibes were good and all that kind of stuff. And Sudeikis kind of muttering, well, she does now, it's like they realized that they cast this incredible singer. So then they were going to figure out a way to use it.
And not just the actors though, also the places, the location in the
Mhm.
story. And so, I think that it's interesting to watch a lot of these shows where there's this kind of American fish out of water, and going abroad, shows like Emily in Paris that
Sure.
put a real shine on certain parts of the world. And the show was shot, all of this cast, a lot of them from the UK, but obviously Jason Sudeikis had to move over, and it was shot in this the town, is it Richmond upon
Yeah.
Thames?
Yeah. Richmond,
And
just for
so,
familiar there.
I think that everyone, quite liked this idyllic, sort of pastoral little place.
Mhm.
Has that town changed a lot?
Oh yeah. I mean, it's kind of been, it's interesting because I was actually just there over the summer and yeah, and I had a couple beers in the pub, which is the basis for the pub in the show, and every other person in the door, and especially every American, was very much like taking pictures, and they have put up some Ted Lasso stuff in there, but now there's Ted Lasso tours, and it has become synonymous sort of globally with this show. And it was kind of an interesting choice. I think originally they were thinking maybe it'd be more of a hard Scrabble kind of place that would sort of rally around the team. We've seen that in sort of other movies and shows and things. But once they sort of saw Richmond and just saw how it is very beautiful. If you ever go there in person, it's like, wow, this does look like a Richard Curtis movie. And so that was part of the equation, right? Because part of what they're paying tribute to with the show, often, sometimes very explicitly, sometimes more implicitly, is like romantic comedies and those kinds of films. And so this is like a really great way to nod at that kind of throughout the series.
Yeah, it really is wonderful, and it shows really wonderfully on screen. As you said, Richard
Sure.
Curtis, I think, is a great comp there. And then throughout the show, throughout all the different episodes, you also really point out in the book there are certain key episodes, and you talk about the arc of it, and Now, we'll talk about this a little bit later, but it was 3 seasons, and
Mhm.
supposedly that will be the end, and no one really knows. But across those 3 seasons, there were some great, pivotal moments. What for you were those moments across the series that you feel like really were emblematic of what the show was and wanted to be?
Yeah, one of the things I did with the book, it is an oral history, that's kind of the spine of it. But the other thing I wanted to do was sort of go deep on certain themes and episodes and people, right, who are involved with the show. And so, throughout the book, there are like these, I guess, these really, robust recaps, I guess, is one way to look at it, that also are about, sort of little mini essays about a different person or a different theme in the show. Like the one about the Beards Night Out, the kind of polarizing episode, is also sort of about kind of the, basically underknown comedy legend, legendary comedy career of Brendan Hunt, right? And so, for me, the things that really stuck out, like the first really great, and I still think the best episode in the whole series is the one with the karaoke bar, right? When they go to Liverpool, and it's a big moment for Nate because he has the thing where he sort of breaks down everybody in the locker room. If you haven't seen the show, he's this very meek character who is given this opportunity to criticize the team, and he does so in very like vulgar, direct, and biting fashion, which is kind of a breakout moment for him. And then there is the scene at the karaoke bar, and we talked about, Hannah Waddingham and her incredible voice. She sings "Let It Go," the Disney hit, and that becomes sort of both a vehicle for her. I guess the beginnings of her delivery out of her depression and rage about the way things have gone for her, but it's also becomes this way for the Ted Lasso character to collapse because his own marriage is collapsing. And so, and then that event brings the two of them together to start building this friendship. So it's just this really elegant episode in that it tied together all these threads and, 30, 35 minutes that were like fundamental to, the thesis of the show as a whole. And it was also very funny, and it was also very, very entertaining. And I feel like the show at its best was able to do that, sort of pack in those emotional layers within a really delightful comedy.
Right.
That does also move you. It's hard to do all those things well all at the same time, and the first season in particular got it right more often than not.
And I think that also, some of these episodes, and there have been great episodes, and ones that there's not really a format necessarily that it
Mhm.
takes, opportunities to drift off with different characters, which is great. But as you point out, I think it was Sudeikis who was saying that he always envisioned this really as a 3-act story, and that's
Mhm.
why sort of the end of the third season that was kind of it. So I mean, do you think now, about a year on, that it is a 3-act story and we're not going to see any more? Is there a chance for a movie, or do we
Mhm.
think that this is the story?
Well, I think there's kind of a couple sort of parallel answers to that question. I think one is yes, the story was the story. The story they envisioned for the show was that 3-act story of him going to Britain to escape a troubled situation at home and kind of work through some things and then come back, in a much better, emotional space. And also like help all these people along the way who are on their own journeys of trying to figure out how to be better people. Right. And so that was done. But I do think the popularity of the show and the fact that Apple has more money than any company in the history of humanity, and uh, the fact that it did set up numerous spinoffs. I mean, I just have to think there will be some attempt at some point. I mean, there were some trade reports about like they're starting to put together a writer's room. They're starting to try to get some deals in place. None of that stuff has been like confirmed on the record, but um, I would expect something to happen. Whether it's it's still Ted Lasso and it's season 4, but it's a very different show now with you know Nate and Roy and Beard leading the team, and Ted coming in over Zoom like every other episode or something. Maybe it's that, or and they also set up one with like it's a women's soccer team, and women's soccer has become only more popular over the past decade. That could be a good way to go. And the show has been pretty good about doing right by its female characters, which isn't always the case. Certainly not in sports movies, sports shows. So there are ways that it could go, and it does feel like all the pressure is for them to keep it going somehow.
Right. I think it's interesting because you want to, at least I think that I would like to, honor like, oh, it's a creative wishes, and they feel like
Right.
the story's been told, and that's that. But then also, it's such an interesting time in the television industry and our business, especially
Mhm.
this year in 2024. We've really come back from the brink of COVID and strikes and all these different things. It feels like production is finally back, but
Mhm.
it's also a tough time, for people to be making television. So I mean, separate from Ted Lasso, that's what I wanted to ask you about is, how you see our business changing, because in this last couple of years there've been so many mergers and acquisitions and all these different things, and from the time that Apple made Ted Lasso to now, there's conversations about, has the bubble burst? Have
Mhm.
we for scripted television, like, have we seen too much? And it's even, becoming more complicated for people to watch things because there's so much contraction.
Mhm.
And then I recommended a show to a friend the other day, and he said, where can I watch it? And I had to think about, like, okay, what company bought which company and which platform does it live on?
Right, right, right.
So, but that's sort of the world now. And
Mhm.
so, obviously we want to see, more television, but what is, from your perspective, what is the industry looking like for the coming year?
Well, for a long time, the story of television was just expansion period, right? It was, there was more shows every year, and then there was going to be more shows a year after that, and this, especially once the streaming services came on, there was just they just made more, made more, made more, and the idea, largely, certainly with in the case of somebody like Netflix, is like we're just going to keep making stuff and try to get as many subscribers as we possibly can, and it's just a pure numbers game, right? um, and that kind of carried the day in the industry for a while, but it was not sustainable. I think everybody kind of knows you can't just spend money heedlessly forever, and so I think what we've seen in the past couple of years is, whether you want to call it a bubble bursting, whether you want to call it like right sizing, whether you want to call it like reality setting in, you have seen people kind of scale back and be slightly more strategic. And as you say, all these, all these mergers are happening. There's all this debt that people are trying to figure out how to pay down. And so things aren't getting released. They're making fewer shows. Shows are lasting, not as long as they once did. Um, so I would suspect that it would continue to be a little chaotic like this. I mean, I hope for the sake of people who work for these studios that they're not going to continue to be, thousands of people laid off the way we've seen, this summer and this year and last year. Um, but I would be willing to bet that there's going to be a pretty convulsive period until people kind of figure out, okay, how can we make all this stuff work? I mean, there's probably going to continue to be continued, deals between, like, okay, well, if I can get HBO Max and, Netflix together under one deal, and they're basically going to recreate the skinny bubble that we, left behind with cable. And so I think there will be some upheaval to come. Also, there's still, as you know, the strike, the things that coming out of the strikes caused some reshuffling of the way people needed to do business. And um, I think there's a lot of things that still need to settle down before anything starts to feel kind of stable in the way it did even, 3 4 years ago. But there's lots of money to be made, and so I'm sure they'll figure it out.
Well, yeah, and I think that also this is the first year that some of that shuffling has settled a little bit, to the point where we talk about, or we used to talk about, like, what is the new fall season of television. There
Mhm.
was a pilot season, and everyone was vying for the same actors and the same talent around town, and then everything would have the upfronts in May and premiere in the fall.
Mhm.
And so, to a much lesser extent now, but there are shows that are coming out that, I think that the marketing dollars are trying to show that there is a bit of a fall season, and
Mhm.
here's some slates that we're presenting to you as everyone goes back to school.
Mhm.
So as we get really kind of deep into fall now in November, are there shows that you are seeing that you feel like are promising offerings for the new year, that are the shows that are coming out of the more traditional system, that have real possibility and could be great hits coming down the line?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. The fall season, which was based on the old, broadcast calendar, has not been, you know, much of a force in TV for a long time. But I do think, partly because of the way the strikes delayed production, and then there's people able to kind of ramp right back up and get going. We do have more. The past couple falls, it was like, do you like game shows? Or do you like reality shows? Because that's what we have. But this year, we're seeing a lot more, new sitcoms, new dramas, new procedurals, all that kind of stuff. And some of them have been very popular already, like that Dr. Odyssey, Ryan Murphy, boat doctor show, and I've enjoyed some of these shows. Like, High Potential, I thought has been pretty charming. Then there's shows like, that are kind of broadcast-ish shows that are on, but there are streaming shows like Elsbeth, I think, is a charming show. Ghosts kind of comes back and forth, and Abbott Elementary is also really great. But we still have the big ticket heaves, right? It's like Amazon spent $1 gazillion on the Lord of the Rings show and continues to be okay at best. This fall, we're going to see Dune, a Dune show, which is not. It takes place like 10,000 years before the movies that we just had. So it's
Harry
not
Potter
really.
series.
Yeah, there's a Harry Potter series in the work, and then next year we'll start having things like that were delayed for a long time, like The Last of Us, right? The second season of The Last of Us, or White Lotus, which is an enormously popular show, especially for people that we talk to every day, right? But Euphoria is gonna come back, so you're gonna start to see a lot of those sort of marquee things coming. So even though we're talking about contraction and cost cutting and fewer shows being made every year, I mean, there's still a lot of really high end stuff coming out.
Well, yeah, it's nice to always see the new things, but I think that also when there aren't maybe as many things, cluttering the shelves as we look out
Mhm.
in the world, it's really nice to be able to go back and revisit shows. And
Mhm.
like Kelly Bishop from Gilmore Girls has put out a book this fall about her experience on that show, and
Mhm.
I think it's a great opportunity when we have a little bit more time to revisit the shows maybe we didn't see the first time around,
Mhm.
and that's why I think this is so fun. So the book is Believe, and Jeremy Egner, thank you so much for coming by. Before I let you go, though, now that we've been talking about Ted Lasso, can you tell me a little bit about if you have in your neighborhood a favorite independent bookshop that you like to go to when you're picking things up to read, and maybe where we can find your book?
Yeah, I'm blessed. I live in Brooklyn, and I'm blessed to have several. But I think the one I go to most is Greenlight,
Yep.
and that's actually where we're going to have the launch party for this book. So I know it'll be there if nowhere else. And I always love going in there, and the people are very smart, and they're very very willing to point you in the direction that you want and need. So that's the one I always recommend to people.
Amazing. Well, very good. Thank you again. And the book is called Believe. It is out now. Jeremy Egner, thank you so much for coming by. Appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a lot of fun. I appreciate it.